Ah, yes, Beethoven's thrusting interlude in the Ninth Symphony. You see, not everything from Europe is bad. Some of it is contentious, though. One of those contentious things from Europe is a new law called the EU Digital Services Act, which seeks to better regulate digital platforms, including social media, and this, of course, includes YouTube. The Act came into effect on the 25th of August 2023, just a few days ago, and social media platforms must ensure they are compliant with it by the 1st of January 2024. Basically, the Digital Services Act forces companies to rethink their policies on illegal content. Now, just to be clear, Brexit means that this Act has no force in the UK. We are now outside the EU, and the Act only applies within the EU and possibly some member states of EFTA. Even so, it is relevant to us here in the UK because, of course, YouTube has viewers and content creators who reside within the EU. And so YouTube is affected by this law, ergo YouTube may have to make changes to its platform, business, terms of use and various policies and standards that will impact on viewers and content creators outside the EU. I think the EU Digital Services Act could in the long run have serious implications for channels on YouTube that involve social harm, or perpetuate social harm, whether legal or illegal. This of course includes auditors. The purpose of this video is to explain why. First, let's take a look at what the EU Digital Services Act does. The Act is quite broad in scope, so I'm not going to cover everything, and a lot of the most important provisions I won't be mentioning here. The ground I will cover here are things of specific relevance to auditors and similar channels. First, the overall purpose of the Act is to improve content moderation on social media platforms to address concerns about illegal and socially harmful content. The Act maintains a current rule according to which companies that host others' data are not liable for the content, as long as they act promptly to remove it. This so-called conditional liability exemption is a long-standing principle, also known as safe harbour. It means that platforms such as YouTube do not have to actively check for illegality. Next, there is an obligation to put in place notice and action procedures where, on receiving notice from a viewer or content creator, the platform must take action to deal with illegal content, and such procedures must have regard to human rights. The Act also requires platforms to disclose to regulators and even private citizens how their algorithms work, something that could be very useful but also has dangers which I'll discuss in a moment. Social media platforms will also be required to put in place measures to ensure transparency on how decisions to remove content are taken and on the way advertisers target users. Social media platforms must have regard to human rights, and particular regard to the right of freedom of expression and the need for media pluralism in society. Platforms must take decisions fairly, not arbitrarily, and provide mandatory redress for content removal decisions. There will also be new rules that will require social media platforms, including YouTube, to assess and manage systemic risks posed by their services, such as advocacy of hatred and the spread of disinformation. Platforms that do not comply with the new obligations risk fines of up to 6% of their annual turnover in the European Union. There will also be a right for individual users to seek compensatory damages against platforms for breaches and infringements of the legislation. Now, in that list, I mentioned an obligation on platforms to disclose how their algorithms work. Social media platforms will need to submit to independent yearly audits and to give regulators and third-party researchers access to platform data and insights into their algorithmic black boxes to ensure greater scrutiny and accountability. I think the main purpose behind these measures is to prevent the intrusive use of data by social media platforms against users, including data harvesting and stuff like that. So in plain terms, what this means is that the Act will require major social media platforms to consider how their algorithmic systems, advertising models and data practices contribute to systemic risks such as social harms and criminal behaviour, and adapt their systems and processes accordingly where flaws are identified. The Act will also ensure people now have the right to choose how content is presented to them in their news feeds, for example by choosing chronological order instead of algorithmic profiling that is tuned to maximise and maintain engagement. This doesn't stop social media platforms engaging in invasive surveillance practices altogether, but it does require them to be more transparent about what they're doing. Now, what has all this got to do with auditors, I hear you ask? Well, auditors talk a lot about photography rights and free expression. Free expression and free assembly are protected by Articles 10 and 11 of the Human Rights Act. What we don't hear them auditors talk about as much are the implications of their activities for their responsibilities to society, and in particular for dignity, autonomy and privacy of the people that they capture in their recordings. Those things are what place a responsibility on those who wish to exercise free expression and similar human rights. Now, so far I've referred to both social harm and illegality. These are separate things in that just because a certain act is socially or morally wrong does not make it a crime. However, the act itself only addresses illegality. But there is an elision of the two. The Act defines illegality in Recital 12, but someone who commits acts that are socially harmful is likely to fall into illegality. And indeed we see this with auditors. And one point I make in my review videos on this channel is how auditors often fall into illegality while carrying out auditing in an aggressive manner. If social media platforms have to monitor how their systems perpetuate harms and remedy these systemic risks and submit to annual audits of system risk by an EU regulator, and if they also have to disclose their algorithmic processes, potentially this new information could be used to pressure those platforms to drive viewers away from or divert viewers away from socially harmful content such as auditing. Obviously, auditing is at the lower risk end of things when it comes to social harms, but even so, auditing can affect a person's dignity, autonomy and privacy. There can be mental health implications, for instance, for someone exposed and humiliated like this on social media. And if that person has done no wrong and was just in their workplace or business, that surely is a strong basis for an argument that auditing comes within a category of social harm. And where it is shown to involve illegal practices, the legislation could be applied to this activity. There will also be arguments that by allowing auditors to upload videos that breach privacy, social media platforms are helping to perpetuate harms. If victims of auditors can bring complaints in which the platform must have regard to human rights, that should mean a greater focus on privacy as a ground for removing videos and ultimately removing offending channels. Where platforms don't remove videos, the Act will allow users to seek compensation. Auditors could equally claim their own human rights, the right to free expression especially. But this has to be balanced with privacy rights, and where the auditor is earning income from the platform, and where it is clear that the interactions captured in the video are not organic, but engineered by the auditor to generate confrontation, the privacy arguments will weigh heavily. In light of all this, it does look like the Act could become a lever to pressure YouTube to crack down on auditors, albeit the legislation does not apply in the UK itself. So how effective the Act is in changing what goes on in the UK side of YouTube will depend on how YouTube itself is organised at the corporate level and its service model, as that will determine where the legal liability is considered to be. I've taken a look at YouTube's terms of service in both the UK and in Germany, and Germany being an example of an EU member state. And the UK terms of service state that the YouTube service provider is Google LLC in the United States, whereas the terms of service in Germany state that the YouTube service provider for the entire European Economic Area and Switzerland is Google Ireland Limited. That suggests to me that Google have deliberately reorganised and restructured their delivery model to reflect the changing regulatory landscape after Brexit. This means it will be harder but not impossible for individual viewers and content creators of the EU Digital Services Act from the UK to bring proceedings under that Act, because the identity of the UK the company that a UK user would ultimately complain against or initiate litigation against would be Google LLC, and that company does not serve the EU and so is not directly subject to the EU Digital Services Act. However, this may not matter, and I don't think it will. Although YouTube has two separate delivery models for the UK and continental Europe respectively, I think in reality Google may choose to go down the route of applying any changes to its content standards in response to the Act to the UK as well as the EU. That will have both good and bad implications. The good implications could include the gradual withdrawal of services for auditing channels that clearly inflict social harms and engage in illegal behaviour. But there's a potential downside, and this brings me to the further topic I want to raise about the EU Digital Services Act, in that there is potentially a more sinister side to it. It seems to me that the real purpose of the Act is not to tackle illegality and social harm online, but to tackle dissenting political and social opinion. That may sound crankish and far-fetched, but what we have to understand is that in the minds of our political elite, who are now mainly of the leftist persuasion, political and social beliefs that are conservative or right-wing are seen as dangerous and harmful in and of themselves, and also that dissent from key pillars of contemporary values such as equality and anti-racism, and dissent from specific things such as anthropogenic global warming. People who dissent from those positions are seen as advocating social harm or saying things that are harmful, if not criminal. It is now effectively the case that if you speak out of turn about certain races or ethnicities, or comment about a social problem in racial terms, you can be visited by the police and possibly arrested or reported for an offence or invited for a voluntary interview. That is not an exaggeration, that is real. It happens. These people, these positions, which are right-wing or conservative, or traditionalist, that may oppose racial integration or the anthropogenic theory of global warming, these positions are what the leftist elite would call disinformation. Not misinformation, disinformation, the difference being that the disinformation implies an intent to mislead. I've read the entire Act, the entirety of this EU Digital Services Act, and I think there is an underlying theme. It is geared towards tackling disinformation. In other words, tackling views, opinions, ideas, arguments, narratives that are out of sync with what the political, social, business and media elite want us to think and say. I'll give you a couple of examples from the Act itself. First, Article 22 of the Act provides that digital services coordinators of the member states, basically the local enforcers, will appoint trusted flaggers who can serve notices on social media platforms under the notice and action procedure in Article 16 that I mentioned earlier. Under Article 22, social media platforms like YouTube must give special weight to and prioritise notices by trusted flaggers, who are basically certified by national authorities due to their expertise. Next, Article 36 of the Act provides for a crisis response mechanism. This mechanism allows the European Commission, in a crisis situation, to require social media platforms to take specific actions. The required actions are limited to a period of 3 months unless extended due to the evolution of whatever is a crisis. Now, a crisis could be something like Russia's action in Ukraine, which the European Union opposed, or it could be another mass hysteria similar to COVID-19. On both those issues, dissenting voices have been characterised as crankish or weird conspiracy theorists spreading disinformation. This same principle could be used to limit speech on issues such as mass immigration. Already the left say that anybody who says white people are being replaced is a conspiracy theorist. Bear in mind what the Act is saying, that social media platforms will be audited and inspected for their algorithmic processes that bring content to the attention of users, and for their ability to minimise and deal with illegal content and any processes relating to that. Basically, this means there is in effect a mechanism in place for censorship of content on social media platforms at the direct or indirect instigation of the European Union's regulators using inspection and audit powers. In the context of the Russian military invasion in Ukraine, the allegations were that grave and widespread violations of human rights were committed against the Ukrainian people, and that online information was manipulated by marginal and fringe commentators to favour Russia. That would seem to be a perfect scenario for the Digital Services Act crisis response mechanism. This mechanism will make it possible to analyse the impact of the activities of social media platforms in response to the crisis, and rapidly decide on proportionate and effective measures to ensure the respect of fundamental rights, which is the official justification, and in reality means that EU regulators would encourage social media platforms to censor any content that challenges or undermines or runs counter to the mainstream narrative, whatever that narrative may be. The whole thing does suspiciously point in the direction of the Great Firewall, which, for those who don't know, is a name given to the combination of legislative actions and technologies enforced by the People's Republic of China to regulate the internet domestically in China. This has the effect of censoring the internet in China by blocking access to selected foreign websites and slowing down cross-border internet traffic. I wonder if the EU Digital Services Act is the beginning of a slow move towards a European firewall, but with a slightly different purpose. The Great Firewall in China has the aim of blocking out foreign influences due to the likelihood that the content would encourage dissent against the Chinese social and political system. The effect of that is to limit access to foreign information sources, blocking foreign internet tools such as Google Search, Facebook, Twitter, Wikipedia and others, and mobile apps, and requiring foreign companies to adapt to domestic regulations regarding the dissemination of information. A European firewall, by contrast, would be more subtle, in that it would not try to block out foreign influence. Instead, it would be blocking out specific types of dissent from the prevailing. This is one of the reasons I'm glad Britain left the EU. Our legal tradition is very different to that on the continent, where there is a much more acceptance of state restrictions on speech and expression. But as I have explained, the EU Digital Services Act will probably still affect the political environment in the UK, as YouTube may decide to apply its policies on EU platforms here as well. And of course, in the UK we have the same political environment, if anything worse in some ways, but perhaps generally a bit more respectful of civil liberties. The UK government has introduced an online safety bill in Parliament, but the measure has greatly been watered down due to lobbying and pressure from social media companies and human rights groups. This watering down has been agreed in the name of protecting our freedoms, but I think these people are a bit like auditors. Auditors say they are protecting our freedoms, but in reality their activities jeopardise our freedoms, and they don't care as long as they make money and have fun at the expense of innocent people. Similarly, the lobbying efforts of social media against any regulations that would require them to treat people decently are not to protect our freedoms, but to protect their profits. I think that the watering down is not to protect our freedoms, therefore. The answer, of course, to harmful content is not for new laws, but for social media platforms, the police and the courts to enforce existing laws. There is a need for balance, and there is a need in Britain for equivalent regulations to those that have been enacted in the EU, but which should better reflect our more liberal traditions, while at the same time requiring social media platforms to tackle harmful behaviour in a more effective manner.